They thought she was cold, distant, and uninterested, but the truth came out the moment someone finally spoke her language. Imagine sitting in a room filled with people dressed in their finest clothes, the kind of setting where every fork is polished, every glass sparkles under the chandelier, and every laugh sounds just a little too practiced. Now, imagine everyone looking toward one woman, not because she demanded attention, but because her presence did it for her. That woman was Yumi Takahara, a millionaire from Japan who had quietly built her empire without ever needing to broadcast it. She wasn't loud, she wasn't flashy, but she had that kind of aura that made you curious. You wanted to know her story, you wanted to hear her voice. Yet, when she stepped into the grand dining hall of the Renaissance Hotel in Cleveland, Ohio, that curiosity quickly twisted into something else. People expected to meet a powerful businesswoman who could command the room, but instead, they were met with silence. Not the comfortable kind, the kind that makes you squirm in your chair. Yumi spoke only a few words of English, carefully chosen, soft and slow. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't distance. It was simply who she was, a woman still learning a language that wasn't her own. The moment she was introduced, you could feel the air shift. The host praised her generosity for donating to the charity. Applause followed, but it didn't take long before small conversations started filling the gaps around her. The truth was obvious. Nobody knew what to say to her. And worse, nobody wanted to look awkward trying. At first glance, Yumi seemed unbothered. She smiled politely, nodded when people gestured toward her, and held her glass of water with both hands like it was her anchor. But beneath that calm surface, there was weight. A heavy, invisible weight of being surrounded by people who looked at you as a mystery instead of a human being. Across the room, servers carried trays of food, weaving through tables with precision. Among them was Danielle Morris, a young waitress in her mid-20s. Danielle had worked long shifts before, weddings, fundraisers, galas. She knew how these nights usually went. Rich folks chatting about vacations, business deals whispered over dessert, polite laughter timed like rehearsed lines. But this night felt different. She noticed how often guests glanced toward Yumi, not with admiration, but with confusion. Some even leaned toward each other, whispering behind cupped hands, their eyes flicking back at her like she was an exhibit in a museum. Danielle tightened her grip on the tray she carried. Something about it didn't sit right. She didn't know who this woman was, didn't know her story, but she recognized that look. The one people gave when they didn't understand someone, and instead of trying, they pulled away. Danielle had seen it before in her own life. At one point, a man in a gray suit leaned too close to Yumi, speaking slower than normal, like she was a child. Yumi smiled politely, but her eyes darted down to her lap. Danielle caught that moment, and it stuck with her. What most of the guests didn't realize was that Yumi wasn't cold or uninterested. She was listening. She was trying. She understood fragments, catching familiar words, piecing together meaning from tone and gestures. But in a room full of people who didn't give her the space to simply be herself, she was trapped in silence. The dinner went on, plates were served, glasses filled, but the energy around Yumi never changed. It wasn't cruelty, not outright. It was worse. It was indifference. A polite wall that no one cared to break down. And yet, as the night stretched, something unexpected was about to happen. A voice from a place no one anticipated was about to cut through that wall and change everything. But before that moment, Yumi would endure the longest hour of her life, sitting at a table full of strangers who didn't really want to know her. The lobby of the Renaissance Hotel in downtown Cleveland was buzzing with activity that night. A charity gala, hosted by a local foundation raising funds for after-school programs, had drawn politicians, CEOs, and donors from across Ohio. Limousines pulled up outside, and guests stepped onto the red carpet in gowns and tuxedos. Inside, the chandeliers burned bright, casting golden light across the polished marble floors. When Yumi Takahara stepped out of the car, she did so without the entourage most millionaires preferred. No assistants, no translator at her side, just her. A tall woman in a deep navy kimono-style dress, her black hair tied neatly into a low bun. She stood out immediately, not only because of her dress, which contrasted against the sequins and designer gowns of the others, but because of the way she carried herself, calm, precise, as though every step mattered. The host, an older man named Richard Klein, spotted her from across the room and quickly hurried over. "Ms. Takahara, we are so honored to have you here tonight," he said with a booming voice. Yumi bowed slightly, her hands folded in front of her. "Thank you very much," she replied, her accent heavy, her words careful. Richard smiled politely, but the small hesitation in her speech registered with those standing nearby. A few exchanged glances, subtle but sharp. Still, Richard took her by the arm and led her toward the main dining hall. The room was impressive. Long banquet tables draped in white, candles flickering in crystal holders, waiters in black uniforms weaving in and out with trays of wine glasses. The sound of clinking cutlery and overlapping voices filled the air. Yumi was seated at a round table near the front, a position of honor. To her left sat a banking executive, to her right a politician's wife. Across from her, 3 men in suits leaned back in their chairs, talking loudly about stock prices and golf. At first, there were smiles all around, introductions, handshakes, a polite toast. The first real attempt at conversation came from the woman to her right. "So, Ms. Takahara, what brings you all the way to Cleveland?" Yumi lifted her head, thought carefully, then said, "Charity, children, important." She smiled, but her words were clipped, broken. She understood enough to know the question, but not enough to elaborate. "Oh, yes, of course," the woman replied, forcing a laugh. She quickly turned back to the man next to her, whispering something Yumi couldn't catch. Across the table, one of the men in suits leaned forward. "Tokyo, right?" he asked loudly, as if volume would help. "You live in Tokyo?" Yumi hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Tokyo." The man grinned, satisfied, and sat back. Conversation ended there. For the next 15 minutes, the table flowed around her like a river cutting past a stone. Conversations about politics, business, even football. None of it included her. And when a brave soul did try, the exchanges ended quickly, leaving behind another awkward silence. At one point, the banker to her left tried again. "Do you, like, Ohio?" he asked, his words slow and exaggerated. Yumi tilted her head. "Yes. Kind people." She meant it. The staff who greeted her had been gentle, respectful, but her answer was brushed aside with a polite nod. From the sidelines, Danielle watched as she refilled glasses. She had been trained not to stare at guests, but her eyes kept drifting back to Yumi. Something about the woman's stillness struck her. It wasn't that she was rude or that she wanted to be above everyone. No, she looked like someone standing behind a glass wall, pounding quietly, hoping someone on the other side would notice. Danielle had seen that look before. She remembered her own first job interview, where people judged her before she opened her mouth, assuming what she knew and didn't know. She could see that same invisible judgment being placed on Yumi. The speeches began. The host stood at the podium, thanking donors, praising contributions, then pointed to Yumi. "And a special thanks to Ms. Takahara, whose generosity made tonight possible." The room erupted in applause. Cameras flashed, heads turned. Yumi stood, bowed deeply, and whispered into the microphone when it was passed to her. "Happy, help, children." She bowed again and sat down. The applause was warm, but the whispers returned as soon as the moment passed. Guests murmured about her accent, her silence, her wealth. Some wondered aloud how someone so powerful could seem so unreachable. But while most saw distance, Danielle saw something else. An opening, a chance to change the way this night would be remembered. Dinner service began. Plates of seared salmon with asparagus were placed in front of the guests, followed by glasses of white wine. Forks clinked softly against porcelain as conversations resumed, everywhere but at Yumi's side of the table. The banker beside her tried again, clearing his throat before speaking. "Ms. Takahara, your business, very successful, yes?" Yumi smiled faintly. She wanted to explain, to talk about the years she had spent building her company in Japan, the risks she took, the long nights, the failures that taught her more than success ever could. But the words in English, those words lived just out of reach. Instead, she nodded. "Yes, many years." The man chuckled. "That's wonderful." Then, almost immediately, he turned to the guest on his other side, diving into a conversation about stocks. Across the table, a younger man leaned toward his companion. "She doesn't understand a word we're saying," he muttered. It wasn't quiet enough. Yumi heard him. Her hands tightened around her fork, but she kept her face composed. The politician's wife beside her gave a polite smile. "You must find America very different?" Yumi hesitated, then said, "Yes, big, different." The woman murmured, already glancing back at her husband. Danielle, carrying a tray of bread rolls, passed by just in time to hear a businessman whisper, "Why even come if she can't talk to anyone?" The man laughed under his breath, shaking his head like the situation was amusing. Danielle's jaw clenched. She forced herself to keep moving, setting down the basket of bread at another table. Years in service had taught her how to smile through rude remarks, but something about this one cut deeper. Back at the table, Yumi pretended not to notice the sidelong looks. She focused on her plate, cutting her salmon into small pieces. She was used to this kind of isolation, though it never got easier. In Tokyo, her colleagues respected her. They understood her brilliance, her leadership, her discipline. But here, in this room, she was reduced to the woman who couldn't speak their language. At one point, Richard, the host, returned to check on her. "Everything all right, Ms. Takahara?" he asked warmly. Yumi nodded quickly. "Yes, thank you." She wanted to say more, that the food was delicious, that the cause mattered deeply to her, that she had once been a child without opportunities herself. But the sentences tangled inside her mind, unformed. Richard patted her shoulder. "Glad to hear it." He moved on, none the wiser. As dessert arrived, mini cheesecakes with raspberries, the chatter in the room grew louder. Politics, deals, vacations. It felt like every topic in the world was being discussed, but none of it touched Yumi. Finally, one guest, perhaps emboldened by too much wine, leaned across the table. "You know," he said, pointing with his fork, "money talks, even if you don't. That's the universal language." The table erupted in laughter, not cruel perhaps, but dismissive. Yumi forced a small smile, but inside, her stomach twisted. She had worked for decades to be seen as more than just her wealth, and here, in this glittering room, they had reduced her to exactly that. Danielle noticed. She had been standing near the back, waiting for her cue to clear plates. She couldn't hear every word, but she caught enough. The laughter, the dismissive tones, the way Yumi's shoulders stiffened, even though her face remained calm. She looked at the millionaire and thought, "They don't see you. They don't even want to try." And that was the moment something sparked inside her. She didn't plan it. She didn't rehearse it. But the next time she passed Yumi's table and their eyes met, she knew she was going to do something no one else in that room dared. But first, Danielle needed the right moment, the smallest opening, to step in and let her voice be heard. The servers moved in and out of the dining hall like clockwork, clearing plates, refilling glasses, making sure every table looked perfect. Danielle balanced a tray of coffee cups, setting them down one by one with practiced ease. But her mind wasn't on the tray. It was locked on that table near the front, the one where Yumi Takahara sat like an island, surrounded by water no one wanted to swim through. Danielle had been raised in Akron, just 40 minutes away. She'd grown up in a house where her mother worked double shifts as a nurse, and her grandmother drilled into her the importance of listening to people. "Sometimes, baby, folks don't need you to fix their problem. They just need you to see them," her grandmother used to say. That stuck with her, and tonight, Yumi wasn't being seen. Not really. She was being looked at, sure, watched like a curiosity, but no one tried to see her. Danielle knew the difference. From her spot near the coffee station, she caught pieces of conversation. "She's probably got translators back home. Must be exhausting for her," one man said. Another replied, "Or maybe she just doesn't care to mix with us. Who knows?" Danielle gritted her teeth. She wasn't the type to jump into strangers' business. A waitress was supposed to serve, smile, and step back. That was the rule. But watching Yumi sit there with that small, polite smile, her eyes wandering the table without anywhere to land, it started eating at her. Finally, Danielle got her chance. She stepped closer with a tray of fresh coffee. As she leaned in, she set a cup in front of Yumi. Their eyes met for the first time. Yumi looked surprised, probably because Danielle didn't look away immediately like the others had. Danielle gave a small nod, just a quiet acknowledgement that she saw her. And in that fleeting second, Yumi's smile shifted. It softened, just slightly. Danielle hesitated, the tray still balanced in her hands. She could almost hear her manager's voice in her head. "Keep it professional. Don't get personal with the guests. But then she thought of all those whispers, all those shallow attempts at conversation that left Yumi stranded at her own table. When the tray was nearly empty, Danielle circled back. She placed another sugar bowl on the table, leaning in closer this time. In a low voice, almost like testing the waters, she said in perfect Japanese, "Would you like sugar in your coffee?" Yumi froze. For a moment, it was as if the entire room fell away. Her eyes widened, her head tilted slightly, and then she whispered back in Japanese, "You speak Japanese?" Danielle gave the smallest grin. "A little," she replied, still in Japanese. "Enough to ask if you want sugar." Yumi let out a quiet laugh, the first genuine laugh she'd had all night. It was soft but full, like a weight had lifted. The guests at the table looked up, confused. They hadn't understood a word. All they knew was that the woman they'd been whispering about had suddenly come alive. Her posture straightened, her smile brightened, and her eyes locked onto Danielle with something close to relief. Danielle set the tray aside on a nearby counter. She wasn't supposed to linger, but she couldn't walk away now. She leaned in again, her voice steady in Japanese. "I studied for years. My high school had an exchange program. I fell in love with the language." Yumi clasped her hands together in gratitude. "Thank you. No one talk tonight. You talk." The table was silent. Guests exchanged glances, some with raised brows, others with uneasy smiles. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the shift. For the first time all evening, Yumi wasn't invisible. But what they didn't realize yet was that this small exchange was only the beginning. The room was about to witness a conversation that would turn their judgment upside down. It started with a murmur, a soft laugh from Yumi that didn't sound forced for once. Heads at her table turned, confused. She had been quiet all evening, offering nothing more than polite nods and short answers. But suddenly, here she was, speaking smoothly, fluidly, in a language none of them understood. "Anata no ribenyu ha totimo shangju desu ne," Yumi said warmly, her voice brighter now. Her words flowed fast, confident, almost like a river that had been dammed all night and finally broke free. Danielle smiled. "Madamada desu," she answered modestly, her Japanese carrying the rhythm of someone who had practiced for years. "But I'm happy I can use it tonight." The entire table froze. Forks hovered in midair. Glasses were left half raised. The guests stared at Danielle, the young waitress in her black uniform, as if she had just revealed a secret superpower. The banker finally broke the silence. "Wait, what language? What's happening?" Danielle glanced at him briefly before turning back to Yumi. She wasn't trying to impress anyone else at the table. She was focused solely on the woman who, for the first time all evening, looked alive. Yumi leaned forward, her voice lowering slightly. "I feel lonely here," she admitted in Japanese. "Everyone is kind, but no one talks with me." Danielle nodded. "I know, I saw it." The guests exchanged nervous looks. One whispered, "What are they saying?" Another shrugged, frustrated. The businessman who had mocked earlier cleared his throat loudly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice tinged with irritation. "What exactly is going on here? What are you two talking about?" Danielle paused, then turned her head toward him. Her answer was calm but firm. "She said she's felt invisible tonight." Then she looked back at Yumi, switching back into Japanese, her tone soft again. "I'm glad you're here, really." Yumi's eyes shimmered just slightly. For hours, she had been surrounded by voices that excluded her. And now, in front of everyone, someone was not only speaking her language, but acknowledging her humanity. The table was restless now. Some leaned in, curious. Others shifted uncomfortably. A woman fanned herself with her hand, whispering to her husband, "Who knew a waitress could do that?" Richard, the host, walked by at that moment and stopped in his tracks when he noticed the scene. "Everything all right here?" he asked cautiously. Yumi surprised him. She turned toward Richard, gesturing to Danielle with a smile. Friend, she said in halting English. Then, in Japanese again, "She gave me a voice tonight." Danielle translated gently. "She said I'm her friend, that I gave her a voice." The table went silent. For the first time all night, no one had a witty remark or a dismissive laugh. They simply stared, realizing that the woman they had judged so quickly had thoughts, feelings, and depth they had never cared to uncover. The banker cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, that's wonderful," he muttered. Yumi turned back to Danielle. "How did you learn?" she asked in Japanese, curiosity lighting her face. Danielle's smile widened. "An exchange student came to my school when I was 16. She was from Kyoto. We became close friends. I wanted to speak to her in her own words, so I started studying. And once I started, I never wanted to stop." Yumi clasped her hands together, shaking her head in awe. "Incredible. You understand me." The warmth in her voice made Danielle's chest tighten. She wasn't just being polite. She was grateful, genuinely grateful. Around the table, the energy shifted. Guests who had dismissed Yumi now sat in stunned silence, realizing how wrong they had been. Their polite indifference had left her isolated, and it had taken someone they hadn't even noticed, a server, not a guest, to bridge that gap. One woman finally broke the silence. "Maybe we should get a translator next time." But the words sounded hollow now, almost embarrassing, compared to what was happening right in front of them. But as the conversation deepened, something even more unexpected began to stir. The guests, once skeptical and dismissive, started leaning in. Not out of politeness, but because they wanted to understand. The noise in the room hadn't vanished, but something about Yumi's table felt different now. Guests who had once leaned away were now tilting forward, straining to catch even a fragment of what was being said. They still didn't understand the words, but they couldn't deny the shift. The quiet woman they'd dismissed had suddenly come alive, and the source of it all was the young waitress who had dared to speak up. Yumi's face, which had been so carefully composed earlier, now carried warmth. She looked at Danielle the way one looks at a long-lost friend. "You are the first person tonight to make me feel not alone," she said softly in Japanese. Danielle nodded. "I could see that. People weren't really trying. They were treating you like you were different, not like you were someone worth knowing." Yumi sighed, glancing at the polished silverware before her. "Always. When I travel, this happens. In meetings, dinners, I give money, they smile, but they do not see me." Danielle lowered her voice. "Back home, I know that feeling too. People look at me, make assumptions. Sometimes they decide who I am before I can even open my mouth. It hurts." That admission made Yumi's eyes soften further. She understood, even without every word being perfect. "We are the same," she replied gently. From across the table, a man cleared his throat. "Excuse me, what did she just say?" Danielle didn't hesitate. She looked directly at him and translated. "She said we're the same." The man blinked, clearly unsure what to make of it. But Yumi wasn't speaking to him. Her attention stayed fixed on Danielle. They began exchanging stories. Yumi told her, in halting but expressive Japanese, about how she had grown up poor in Osaka, working in her parents' tiny corner shop before she built her own business. She shared how she'd been laughed at in boardrooms early in her career because she was a woman, how she had been underestimated over and over until she proved them wrong. Danielle listened intently, nodding, sometimes asking questions. When Yumi paused, Danielle shared her own piece, how she had balanced school and work, how she once thought waiting tables was just temporary, but now she saw moments like this, where she could connect with someone, as more meaningful than anything. At one point, Yumi laughed again, a real laugh that drew glances from nearby tables. She covered her mouth politely, but her eyes shone. "You're Japanese. Better than some of my business partners," she teased. Danielle chuckled. "And your English is better than you think. You just need people who actually want to listen." There was something about that line that struck everyone within earshot. Guests shifted in their chairs, pretending to sip wine, but really they were listening now, not just to the foreign language, but to the rhythm of two women finding common ground. A woman at the table finally leaned forward. "Can you ask her what brought her here? Why she chose this charity?" Danielle glanced at Yumi. "She wants to know why you came." Yumi tilted her head, then replied, "Because I was once a child who could not dream big. I want other children to dream." Danielle translated, her voice steady. "She said when she was a child, she didn't believe she was allowed to dream big. And now she wants other children to have that chance. The table went silent again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective. For the first time all evening, people weren't whispering about Yumi. They were listening to her story through Danielle's words. And with every sentence, the walls that had separated her from the room began to crumble. But the real impact wasn't just in what was said, it was in what the guests began to feel. For the first time, they weren't looking at a millionaire or a foreigner. They were looking at a human being. By the time coffee had cooled in the cups and the last plates of dessert were cleared, the atmosphere around Yumi's table had changed completely. The same guests who once avoided eye contact were now leaning in, not out of politeness, but because they wanted to hear more. Danielle continued to translate where needed, but sometimes she didn't have to. Sometimes a smile, a nod, or the warmth in Yumi's tone was enough for the meaning to travel across the table. It wasn't dramatic. No speeches were made. No one stood up and declared a revelation. But in the quiet glances, in the softened voices, something had shifted. People realized how quick they had been to reduce someone to silence simply because they didn't share the same language. As the dinner drew to an end, Richard, the host, approached once more. "Ms. Takahara, we cannot thank you enough for your generosity tonight," he said, his words more deliberate now, more careful. Yumi smiled and replied slowly in English, each word chosen with care. "Thank you for letting me share." But then she turned toward Danielle, and her voice softened as she spoke in Japanese. "Tonight, I will not remember the food or the speeches. I will remember you." Danielle felt her throat tighten, but she managed a smile. "I'll remember you too," she whispered back. The guests watched in silence, some of them ashamed at how blind they had been only hours earlier. The banker who had spoken down to her earlier cleared his throat, his face a little red. "I suppose we should have tried harder," he admitted quietly. His words weren't directed at anyone in particular, but the truth in them lingered over the table. Yumi rose from her seat, bowed politely to everyone, and then extended her hand to Danielle. The room stirred. How often did you see a millionaire showing such open gratitude to a waitress? Danielle hesitated at first, but then she took her hand firmly. That moment told the entire story. Respect doesn't flow only from the top down. Sometimes it moves the other way, from the overlooked to the celebrated. Guests whispered again, but this time it wasn't judgment. It was awe. A few even applauded softly as the two women stood together, a picture of connection that money or status couldn't manufacture. When the night finally ended and Yumi prepared to leave, she turned back once more. In English, she said slowly, "Thank you, Danielle. You are my bridge." Danielle didn't need to translate that. Everyone understood. And that's the lesson that lingers. How many times do we look at someone and decide, without ever speaking to them, who they are? How many opportunities do we miss because we think the effort to connect is too difficult or not worth our time? That night, in a grand hotel ballroom, a millionaire and a waitress reminded everyone of something simple but powerful. Understanding starts with willingness. Respect starts with listening. So the next time you find yourself in a room with someone who feels out of place, ask yourself, am I building a wall or am I building a bridge? Because one act of empathy, one willingness to step closer instead of pulling away, can change the way a person remembers an entire night. If this story moved you, let it push you to action. Look around you, in your workplace, your school, your community. Who's sitting quietly at the table, unheard? Be the one who notices. Be the one who speaks up. And if this story resonated with you, share it. Someone else might need the reminder that the smallest voice can carry the biggest message.